Identity as the control plane. So, there's my nerd joke for the presentation right there. My name's Joe Kaplan. I am a IT guy at Accenture. I've been working there for a long time, and I been doing directory stuff for, I don't know, like 15 years or so. My focus has had always previously been sort of more in the application space, more so than the infrastructure space. I didn't come up as an IT administrator. I came up as a developer, basically, and have recently kind of switched over into InfoSec and security. So it's all kind of new to me, but have a different role. I had this book that I wrote a long time ago, which is sadly more or less still relevant because none of those APIs have changed. So if anyone is still writing LDAP code for .NET, it's still there. All right, so what's really about to happen? So the talk is called Identity as the Control Plane. I'm going to bait and switch you a little bit. We're going to talk about the concept of identity as the control plane briefly, but then we're actually going to just start talking about the control plane, which I consider to be conditional access. And then I'm going to bait and switch you again, and we're going to do a little bit more of a deep dive on the whole device-based authentication infrastructure within conditional access, because I think this is by far the most interesting and also mysterious and complicated part of the whole thing. And my goal is to help you guys walk out of here with a better concept of how that stuff actually works and how cool it is and how interesting it is. Honestly, I think it's the coolest thing in the platform, and my goal is to make one of you think that when you leave. All right, so let us. So what is a control plane? I feel as if going to a boutique identity management conference and trying to convince a bunch of people in the audience that identity is the control plane is not something I need to spend a whole lot of time on. Possibly this is still something that many of us are trying to convince our bosses, especially those people who have the IT security organization that came up from the network guys. Network guys are hanging onto their firewalls, and it's still a little bit hard to dislodge. But I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here a little bit. But I think it's definitely relevant because the workloads are shifting outside of the organizational boundary, and there's no way to stop that. That is just the way the world is going to work. And the sooner everyone gets used to this idea and understands that this is the place that we're going to be managing access to stuff, the better. I throw these two things up here to reflect on briefly from my recent personal experiences. So everyone heard about the Deloitte breach a little while ago, back in, I think it was September. As far as I understand it, the crux of the compromise was that Deloitte had a bunch of sensitive email data that was compromised out of their Office 365 system. And the way that was actually breached was via a Office 365 Exchange administrator who was also sadly not logging into the platform using multi-factor authentication. So he got phished, and they went in there and just started reading emails until they found some juicy bits. And it's incredibly bad for those guys. This is like the biggest systems integrator in the world in terms of IT cybersecurity. They're like totally killing us in this field. We want this business, and but we don't have this business yet. And this is bad. This is not something that they want to have to deal with. Oh, and it's an identity-related breach. So there is that. Did anyone hear about the Accenture security incident that happened to us?
Oh, the Accenture.
It's okay to mock my employer. It's fine. I know that some of you have worked with my people in the field, and I hope we added value. So we had a sort of an interesting thing happen to us a little while ago. A security researcher discovered that we had some really, really sensitive data available on the public internet. And what he did was he found an S3 bucket in AWS that was filled with goodies, including, according to the researcher, like all of the like a bunch of like usernames and passwords of sensitive stuff in plain text files, and like all of their Azure Key Vault key material, and it just went on and on. It was just like horrifying. This was just a published article. It's not clear that we were ever actually breached as a result of this, like anyone actually ran off with this data. So I've spent a lot of time working on both of these problems. I didn't actually help Deloitte with the Deloitte breach, but so the problem for us was when the CISO said, "Don't we run Office 365 email? Wow, could that happen to us?" And then he didn't like the answer, and we've been really, really busy on that ever since. The S3 thing is that's also been keeping us up at night quite a bit lately as well. But I mean, I think the bottom line here is that this is definitely the way the world is going. These are both basically identity-related breaches that have nothing to do with any network surface that I will ever control, and it's time to move on. I guess one other thing I'll throw in here is that I don't think your networks are going away. It's not like that control plane is going to cease to exist. So perhaps some of the more subtle things to try and bring up in the conversations is maybe it's more of like a funding priority thing. Like, is the identity stuff really getting funded the way it needs to internally? Because a lot of times it's difficult getting inside the head of the network security guys to understand how they should be thinking about the problem. So anyway, enough of that. Switching gears, conditional access. So this has been talked about a fair bit throughout the conference. And so, curiosity, overall familiar, anyone like using this stuff extensively, or just sort of curious? Like, I assume we've got some Azure AD and Office 365 customers in here, but I'm just sort of curious, like how many people are way into this stuff already, or just like kind of curious? Curious? All right. So if you're already using this stuff a bunch, a lot of this stuff will be introductory. So essentially, Azure AD Conditional Access is a feature of Azure Active Directory. And I'll get into the licensing stuff around it later. But functionally, what it is doing is providing a way for you to gate access to resources, okay? And the resources can be basically anything that's integrated with Azure Active Directory, which covers a whole giant surface area of things. So it can be all of your normal Office 365 SaaS applications. It can be other third-party SaaS applications. It can be your on-prem stuff through App Proxy. It can be other stuff that you have, like basically anything that you can integrate with the gallery or as a developer app. That can do single sign-on through Azure Active Directory can be managed with conditional access. And it is from an engineering perspective, I'm pretty impressed with the framework they've created. It's a really rich policy engine. So, well, I guess on the other side, it's important to point out that it incorporates a really wide spectrum of devices. So it's not just your corporate laptops. It's also all the mobile devices floating around out there. It's unmanaged workstations. It's also Mac OS. There's a really broad spectrum of things that can participate in this stuff. They can be inside your network. They can be outside your network. And then the actual policy language is really rich and expressive and has a bunch of these different kinds of things called conditions. So let me just move on to the next bit and we'll dive into a little bit more. Okay, so I think the way I think it is most useful to explain it is to just actually just talk about some potential conditional questions, like what could you do with this? So I'm just going to read. When Accenture employees are trying to access anything in Azure, they must perform multi-factor authentication. All right, so that is an expression of a conditional access policy. It's one that we actually have deployed. Literally, all cloud apps require multi-factor authentication to get in for all users, all devices. And you can do that, but you can do a whole lot more than that. So here's another one that you could do. So when these specific users access this specific application, they must also use a domain join PC. And this is in addition to the MFA requirement. But it gets really interesting in the policy language because you can stack these things together. They can overlap and have hierarchies. There's ands and ors involved. So it's an incredibly rich and expressive policy language. It's based on this notion of like what the condition statement is. When this, then these are the controls I want to do. So over here on the side, we have, this is the only screenshot I'm going to show of the actual portal. I think this is probably the most interesting one, but there is a bunch of stuff in here. So there's this notion of a grant. A grant can either block access, which is like can't get in, so I can either block access or grant access. If I'm granting access, I can also put all these additional conditions on it, and then, like I said, you can kind of stack these up together. So we'll get into some of the conditions here coming up, but and then there are a bunch of other tuners related to this stuff as well too. Like you can add additional things like only apply this to these kinds of devices, only apply this to coming from these kinds of locations. And so it's really, really interesting, rich, and expressive policy system for doing this stuff. Any questions so far?
Yeah. Joe, do you impose it on the application or the tenant the same MFA requirement? You mentioned you use it for application.
So you're always protecting access to a resource. So that's generally going to be an application that's in Azure. You can say all cloud apps, which is what we did for our MFA policy. All cloud apps is interesting because it also blocks a bunch of things that don't actually have individual applications in the portal itself. So you will find all sorts of weird things in the back end may break from that. But it also it patches all your holes that you don't really know about. But and it's interesting too because you can say I can do all cloud apps. I can also do a list of cloud apps. So I can have a policy that I apply to a bunch of things. I can also have a policy that I apply to a specific application, and they can stack together hierarchically as well. It's rich enough that I think that you could get into a thing of spending some time thinking about how you actually want to design your policies to be manageable. It's enough complexity to actually turn into a software engineering problem, but we won't get into that either. All right. So we're going to delve into the controls. I'm going to try to run through the controls relatively quickly, and I'm going to hit a bunch of them at a pretty high level. And then we'll kind of move on to some of the other stuff a little bit later. But so let's hit this. So MFA, this is probably the most obvious thing, and I think this is the thing that every organization should do. Like if you don't have this, you pretty much have to do this. I think it's just table stakes for being on the internet these days, and you have to find a way to get this done. Not only because it makes you more secure, but it also will make you more believable to all your auditors as to how everything else is going to happen. You just have to do this. I'm not going to talk about it at all. But the main thing is that once you have it, you can use it as a condition in your conditional access policies, and you have a tremendous amount of control. So if you really want it for this thing but not this thing, or this thing in this condition but not in other conditions, then you can turn it on and off wherever you want to. I recommend you just turn it on. One of the other neato things, I guess, with MFA is that, so generally speaking, you're thinking you're going to be doing Azure MFA. There's actually a fair amount of flexibility in this as well. There are other MFA providers. You can also, if you have a federated tenant, so you're authenticating on-prem with ADF Fast or something else, you can trip this flag on in Azure AD on your federation settings object that says supports MFA is true. And then what will happen is that every time Azure AD wants to have you MFA, it will actually bounce you back down to on-prem and say, ADFS, please MFA the user and tell me they're MFA'd. And whatever you have in your on-prem ADFS will be trusted for that. We actually use that pretty extensively internally. So pretty flexible. That's where we find all the interesting bugs. That part is probably not tested as robustly as some of the other use cases. But in any event, okay, so location, basically the ability to restrict access to things based on IP ranges and whatnot. Like, where is the client coming from? Are they here? Are they there? There's basically a bunch of different ways that you can do this. There's a specific countries feature that's in preview. I haven't played with it. There's also this notion of MFA trusted IPs. And there's a notion of inside-outside stuff that you can do with it. I am not a huge fan of this stuff, and it's possibly just because I have a weird perspective on my user base. But my user base is generally a bunch of consultants spread out all over the world. They're all on the public internet, and and even when they're inside my networks, I don't necessarily think that my office networks are really all that much more secure than the public internet. Like, a little bit more secure, but I actually don't think that just being on the office network somehow means that you shouldn't MFA. So we don't use this at all internally, and I also don't think that a lot of this stuff is really maintainable at scale. Chasing IP addresses around is kind of a hard problem, but it's there. If you want to use it, you can use it. Yeah?
The one thing I'll add is that those same trusted locations also influence the quality of the data in the security reports. So if you don't put them in there, you will get bad data.
Oh, interesting. Okay. All right.
It's the scenario you're describing. You're talking about so for on-prem users with ADFS, are you talking about using reduced sign-in, like were you doing forms log-on, or are you using Kerberos and then stepping up with MFA where you use it?
So,
if there's no distinction, when you said there's no distinction.
Right. So we do some funny stuff with our ADFS. So we internally we have a federated tenant. So basically all Accenture.com users in Azure AD get redirected to ADFS to authenticate. Our ADFS actually generally is always authenticating everyone on the public internet, but we're actually using integrated auth for that as well, for the username and password part. And then we're also doing MFA on top of it. Basically, there's a whole bunch of different ways to do this stuff. I think that the bottom line is that you've got a substantial amount of flexibility to make this work for the way your org model works. Lots of people have really, really different deployments and use cases than we do. So, you can do a lot of things, and you won't necessarily do what we do because our business is different from a lot of people's. All right. So, Riz, did anyone attend John's talk yesterday? Azure Identity Protection? No? No one did? Oh. That's unfortunate. I was hoping that everyone had attended that. I didn't get to attend it either because I went to Chris's talk, which is awesome. Yeah, so this is a really, really cool feature of the platform. I think this is actually the future of safe authentication is this platform they've built, and the feature is called Azure Identity Protection, but the basic idea is that you're authoring policies that are based on the assessed risk of the login as determined by Azure. So they're using a bunch of signals and machine learning to actually examine the login, make a decision as to whether or not they think the risk is basically high, medium, or low. And based on the resource that you're trying to access and the risk associated, you can have other conditions happen. Like you can't get in at all. You have to re-MFA. You have to do this, this, and this. So this is a really, really interesting thing. I think that this I'm hoping that this will actually replace a lot of the location-based stuff in the future, because I generally tend to think that the machine learning stuff is going to be able to figure out the risk better than you can and make some more interesting decisions. But anyway, that's all we're going to talk about with that, because I assume that everyone else went to John's talk yesterday. All right. So managed or compliant device, this is also frequently referred to as domain joined or compliant. They've actually changed the language of this in the portal like multiple times, and I'm having a little trouble keeping up. So I tend to call this managed, but in the portal it appears as domain joined again. So this is my favorite feature of the stack, and we will be talking about this a little bit more as we move along. But so the idea here is that in this model, we can treat the device as a first-class citizen of the authorization policy. And so it's not just who is the user, it's who is the user and what device are they using. And it allows me to do things like I stated in that one conditional example. This application is really, really sensitive. I want to make it available to you, but I want to make sure that you're actually using my machine to get to it, whereas I might not care about that for something like OA. Or something like that. But the idea is making the device a first-class citizen of the model, and then being able to actually know if the device that I've identified is either domain joined or compliant through some other mechanism, and being able to do stuff based on that. So this is a feature that we're really excited about, which I'll probably explain a little bit more in a sec. Any questions so far? All right, so I think it's worthwhile to review the licensing related to how all of the conditional access stuff works. I believe I've done this correctly, but Brian will probably correct me if I haven't, because he actually sells this to people all the time. So first thing to know, for conditional access in general, you need to be Azure AD Premium P1 at minimum, or EMS 3. The other kind of gotcha in there is that for this feature, this is what's called a full tenant licensing feature, which means you have to basically buy it for everyone. Some things are available a la carte, but you can't buy this for one person and use it for everybody. Although they don't actually have a mechanism to enforce that necessarily, but your sales guys will make sure that they get all their money for this eventually. So MFA, so ignoring the Office 365 MFA stuff, but MFA in general is also basically a P1 level thing. Intune, which we'll be talking about when we get into like the device ecosystem stuff. Intune, EMS 3 and 5. All right. AIP, and why do they have to have two AIPs in the same platform? It's really horrible. Information protection and identity protection. Okay. But in any event, this is a P2 EMS 5 thing. So this is where you start to pay the extra megabucks to get to it. And it's full tenant license, so it's all in. It's not like getting Azure Privileged Identity Manager, which you can buy for specific administrative users, and it's not like for CAS, where you can also buy it for specific users. Everyone know Cloud Access Security, CASB? Okay, I'm not going to talk about that really much at all, but yeah, the bottom line is that this one tends to be like a big chunk of change, especially if you're a big org. There's also this notion of custom controls, which is the ability to add your own custom controls on top of stuff, which is like a pluggable framework. There's some built-in custom controls that are available now with things like Duo Security and Trusona, but you can also do your own stuff in there as well too. If you want that, that's also P2 EMS 5 full tenant. Okay. So I want to talk about us a little bit, because that will maybe help you guys understand kind of where we're at. So we're a big company. We have about 500,000 active user objects in our Active Directory. It's about 430 K employees and contractors. And one of the other interesting tidbits is that we had about 70,000 people leave last year, but we grew our headcount. So just imagine the HR and recruiting apparatus that it takes to hire that many people. It's really, really interesting, the scale and the churn of things. We were big time into ADFS really early on and have been for a really long time. That was actually when I used to present at DEC conferences in the past. My first talk was about LDAP programming, and then I just kind of started talking about ADFS, and no one would listen to me, like, what is that? Back in 2007 or 8 or whatever it was. But we now have one of the most terrifying monstrosities in the history of the platform. I think ours is worse than Microsoft IT in terms of the overall number of things. So we've got a 3.0 deployment. It's like way over 100 web front ends, and it has crazy multi-data center failover because it can never, ever go down. It's actually allowed 0 minutes of planned maintenance per year and 5 minutes of unplanned downtime in the SLAs that our leadership has tried to establish for this platform. So imagine trying to do an upgrade. We have over 5,000 relying parties in the system, and we have 70 claims providers, which is also kind of nutso. So it's a big old giant thing that we have going on here. And then we have our own MFA thing that I talked about before. So we use Semantics product for this, and there's like more than 2,000 apps, and basically everyone in the company has the multi-factor auth enabled for them. So it's a big MFA deployment. We actually already had that before we got to Azure as well too, which was kind of cool because we were able to just use it, which is nice. So the other thing that we've always done that makes us a little bit weird and interesting is that we were kind of like the original BYO company. We've been putting web apps on the public internet for years and years and years. Like generally speaking, that is our standard deployment. So basically the way IT provides services to eccentric consultants is web-based applications that they access through a browser on the public internet. And you can maybe sort of imagine why, if you're a consultant who's working in somebody else's building and possibly on, like, not even on the Accenture laptop that we gave you because the client makes you use theirs and you don't necessarily want to have to carry both of them around all the time. If people need to get work done, this is how people have always gotten work done. We've been really confident that we could secure this stuff with basically with a lot of SSL and a lot of good, strong single sign-on stuff, including MFA, for a really long time. One of the things that I think is like sort of the gut check for us is that some of these apps are pretty sensitive, and maybe we would actually like sort of a little bit envious of the kinds of controls that people have where you can only get to these things from on-prem, and how can we actually claw some of that back? And that's one of the things that's really appealing about the whole managed or compliant device discussion, is how can we actually maintain our super forward deployment model and still get more control over what things are logging into that stuff. Because generally speaking, I've always been able to log into most of that stuff from this thing, which is my personal laptop. And that's not necessarily the case anymore. So the other big thing is that we have been on the conditional access train with Microsoft for probably like 2 years. We've been working with them on this product. I'm really specifically working on MFA and device-based auth stuff. Those are kind of our babies, but we've been trying to drive this for a really long time. We have also, I think, about 50 or 60 apps that are integrated in Azure besides just the core Office 365 stuff. And one of the things that I would submit to you, so there are a bunch of people in here that do ADFS Federation stuff, and you're integrating apps with ADFS. So I would challenge you to think about if you're an Azure AD customer, how you're doing that. I believe that workload belongs in Azure now. You should be doing all those configurations as Azure apps, either through the gallery or as dev apps. But I think you want that workload in the cloud, because you really don't want, like, there has to be an exit strategy for ADFS, right? If you're really committed to the cloud, you want this thing to eventually go away. And like, imagine what my hosting bill is for this. I actually know what the hosting bill is for this, because it's hosted in AWS, and they actually directly charge us for it, and it's really, really horrifying. But the bottom line is that once you have these things in Azure, you can actually take advantage of things like conditional access and all these other value-added services on top of stuff. And this is compute you already paid for. Like, this is part of what you got, and you're not using it if this stuff is all still going back to on-prem. So that is my thought. I think you should be doing all of your single sign-on integrations in Azure some way or another. And if they're in the gallery, do the gallery. If they're not in the gallery, put them in the gallery. Ask Microsoft to put them in the gallery. If you have your own custom apps, put them in the gallery or use dev apps. But there's ways to get all your stuff out there. And my goal is that all 5,000 of those relying parties will be out of ADFS and into Azure, and I'll be down to one, which will be Azure AD at some point in the future. All right. Let's take a deep and cleansing breath. And let's talk about device-based authentication a little bit. All right. So device-based authentication. First of all, so the first thing that really needs to happen in order to make the device-based authentication stuff work is that the devices have to get registered. And like we said, there's an ecosystem that participates in this. So the things that can actually participate in the device-based auth ecosystem, Windows 10, which is special, and we'll be talking about how special Windows 10 is a lot. 7 and 8.1 can also participate in this. Mobile, and by mobile I specifically mean Android and iOS. Although the Windows Phone 10 actually supports this stuff really well, but I'm hoping that none of you are still using it. And the features are, there's no investment. That's dead. So, and then we also have Mac OS, which is, it's still, I feel like it's in redheaded stepchild participation mode of the model, but it's kind of getting there. So the way things actually get registered, in Windows, there's essentially like kind of two ways. If you have a domain joined device, you can register things through basically through group policy and in SCCM, and the things will basically just magically register themselves, more or less. And once you have like the plumbing all set up and whatnot, so you have your Azure AD. There's Connect is also implicit in this stuff as well too. But once you have this configured, the machines will just register themselves. In Windows 10, this specific scenario is called Domain Join Plus Plus or DJ Plus Plus. So if you're ever on a support call with Microsoft and you're talking about how what you're doing and you say DJ++, then you'll gain instant credibility and you'll like short circuit to the next tier of support. Yeah, or if you're ever in a conversation with Hyro, who wrote all this stuff, or his team wrote all this stuff, that's also a good thing to know. For Windows 10, there's also this notion of Azure AD join, which is a little different in terms of how the machines get configured, but similar. And then there's also Add Worker School account. That'll also actually get you registered. You will never actually get to be, well, I won't say never, but you're generally never going to end up managed or compliant as a result of doing that, though. So it's something to keep in mind.
Is that even if when you join it with MDM as well?
Well, so yeah, that's the question. Is anyone ever going to MDM manage Windows machines? I don't know. So the stats that I've heard from Microsoft and the number of people who've taken that pill are very, very, very low. I think there's like, they have, the last conversation I had about this with them, which was probably back in May, there were like 3 customers doing this, and there were like a really tiny number of actual things managed this way, and almost all of them was one one customer. This will probably change in time, but I think I don't think Windows management is going to move away from SCCM anytime soon. I think this is going to, until there's a lot of maturity in the Intune space, this is not going to really move. Chris?
MDM managed machines is when you have, you're managing small businesses and they're like on an E3 license, they're not going to be for Intune.
Mm-hmm.
And the only way to do it and keep control of it is to use MDM. And so I think there's a lot of managed service providers are using that sort of functionality.
Could be. Yeah, I mean, and like from my seat in this like giant IT shop, with my 500,000 users, I don't necessarily get nearly as much exposure to a lot of the stuff going on in that area. But bottom line is that the like in Windows 7 and 8.1, there's also a similar way that things can be registered via group policy. You have to deploy this package. The trivia point with 8.1 is that it actually came with the software installed, but that software turned out to not be functional enough to really be reliable and needed to be replaced, but they didn't actually service it, so now you actually have to distro the same SCCM, the same package for SCCM for 7 and 8.1 in order for it to reliably work. But on the third try, they did finally get that mostly right. So you can do that, and then 8.1 also has add worker school account as well. Are a lot of 8.1 people out there? Most people I know never really deployed that corporately. We actually had like 2,000 or 3,000 of them floating around in our environment, but that would be a proof of concept more so than an actual workstation platform. Okay, so. Mobile is primarily MDM. There's also the MAM scenario, which is totally fascinating, and I'm still trying to figure out exactly how device registration figures into MAM, because not all MAM scenarios result in the device getting registered, and how MAM managed stuff will participate in conditional access is still a bit of a mystery to me, actually, and I think to Microsoft, because they're definitely writing this as we speak. But there will be a MAM story, which I think is really important from the personal mobile space as well. And then,
In what situations do MAM devices not get registered?
Actually, the way it was just explained to me the other day is that the only time they get registered is if you use the Outlook app. If you actually, like if you have a custom app that you just put in the portal, put the MAM wrapper around it, that won't actually, and you download it and use it, that will not actually result in a registration taking place. This may change, like based on the discussion I had with the feature team about this. This was that they may actually change some of the plumbing of how this stuff works, because we have some requirements around doing terms of use for MDM that need state management, and anyway. I think this may change. Like I said, the MAM is a hot and very, very moving space, and I'm not even going to try to explain, because literally I don't think we've gotten any of this stuff to work yet, and I don't really even pretend to understand it. JAMP is kind of the same thing on the Mac side. There is MDM. Intune MDM for Mac. I don't know if anyone uses that. I think most corps use Jamf, and they do have device registration support coming for Jamf. It's in preview. We haven't had a chance to try it yet either, but we're actually banking on that being the way that our corporate Macs get into this stuff as well too. Right now, all of the policies that we're authoring where people really, really need to use a Mac just get excluded from the managed or compliant device, which is cool that you can do that, but it's not really actually what you wanted to accomplish from a security perspective. It was just like the only compromise that could be come up with. Since we couldn't support them, it didn't seem fair. All right.
Joe, just to clarify one thing, when you talk about Azure AD join versus work join, are you referring to the factory for first time you sign in.
Like you're actually logging
Right.
in with your Azure AD account as opposed to logging in with a live ID and then using the worker school
Or
account.
going in
Yeah.
through the
Yep.
GUI later on and then subsequently doing it,
Mhm.
which isn't the same.
Yep. Yeah, is anyone doing that? I actually just totally did that to my wife's laptop the other day. She has like a little Azure tenant that she uses for her email for her little one-person consulting business, and I was rebuilding her machine from scratch. And I was like, I'm going to Azure AD join her machine and see what happens. It's been fun. In any event, let's keep going. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when a device is registered. So, yep.
I'll make one comment, because my previous place we did that with small businesses.
Mhm.
What we ended up by having to do is use a quote service account to join all the machines with, because inside the management console it puts it under the user account that the machine was first joined to the domain with. And if you just let people join it on their own,
Mm-hmm.
you end up with never being able to find the machine, because they're under whichever user happened to be the first one to log on to the machine is the user that owns it.
Gotcha.
So we ended up by, and these are small like health clinics and
Mhm.
stuff, so we ended up by saying, the first user to log on to the machine and do the join is always this, effectively a workstations service account.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That also enabled us to get in no matter
Right. Oh,
what.
yeah.
And
Okay.
it's one of these cases where Active Directory domain join machines is like so much easier than having to deal with Azure domain join machines.
Yeah. I could totally see that. In the data model itself, there's this notion of an owner and registered users, which may or may not get stored depending on how it got registered as well too, which also inform the semantics of certain behaviors. We're not going to get to that level of detail. There are no demos here, by the way. And I'm starting to run a little low on time, and Sean's session is supposed to start right when I'm done. So I'm going to try and kind of burn through this a little bit quickly and maybe leave a couple minutes for question and for Sean to get set up. But so the primary thing to know is that device registration ends up with basically an object in Azure AD in all cases. Unless you're using the weird thing with ADFS on-prem device registration, which I hope you're not doing. I think that is something that will end up being a regrettable decision. There may be some organizations that really need that, but I'm ignoring that use case. We're talking about things that are registering in Azure AD. So all the use cases, there's a device object that ends up in Azure AD. What happens is, so it varies a fair bit from device to device. Like all the MDM use cases are interactive. You log in, you do the company portal thing, and when you're doing the company portal thing, that's when your device registration actually occurs and the object ends up in Azure AD. With Windows 10, it's quite a bit more exotic. Because the machine will actually register first, and then the user will also authenticate and register, and there's some mirroring of tokens that goes on and whatnot. And then, Windows 7 is sort of like kind of weirdly in between. The bottom line is that all these devices will eventually get a certificate, which is used for doing authentication stuff. Sometimes the certificate is used directly. We'll talk about auth in a sec, but the bottom line is you end up with a public key, private key pair in a certificate that's issued by Azure AD. And generally speaking, on your Windows machines, this is also going to be protected by the TPM. So it will, not on Windows 7 because that's not supported, but in 8.1 and up, that cert will be TPM protected. I'm also skipping all the hello for business stuff. As well, which is actually directly related to this whole ecosystem, because Hello for Business also ends up as like input into the same stream. But in any event, let's keep going. All right, so managed, domain joined. The bottom line here is that it has to do with the registration mechanism. So Windows devices that are domain joined can, the 7, 8, 1, and 10 devices, when they're registered through GPO, will end up getting a a flag that is set on the device object in Azure AD called isManaged, and this state just sticks. Like at the time of registration, this thing will become managed by virtue of the way that it was registered through this process. Okay? MDM devices generally will not get the isManaged flag. In the policy language now, like I showed the screen, it says domain joined. Managed and domain joined are essentially the same thing. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about compliance. So in the data model, there's actually an isManaged and an isCompliant flag, and you can actually be both. You could also be one or the other, which frequently happens. But compliance is basically, it is something that is also set on the object. Compliance is generally going to be managed with Intune, although there is the ability to do compliance with SCCM for domain joined machines as well too. This is something we actually haven't done yet, but if you have the ability to go and do compliance checking with SCCM, you can actually have it end up setting this data on your machines that are domain joined as well too. The other thing that's interesting about compliance is that things can become uncompliant. So if your MDM device stops phoning home or something happens to it where it's not compliant, its compliance state will change. I'm not exactly sure how often, but because I don't really understand the MDM stuff that well, but that can happen. All right. So let's see here. Authentication. So authentication is, it's basically Windows 10 and everything else. So Windows 10 is very special in terms of how it behaves. And one of the things I think is most interesting about Windows 10 is this component of the operating system called the token broker. But essentially the token broker is able to generate a login token for Azure AD based on the key material that's in the operating system, this thing that's protected by the TPM. And it can generate a login token based on this and using this notion of these things called primary refresh tokens, which are refreshed kind of like curb tickets, except it's against Azure AD, but can generate a token that can be supplied to downstream systems such as a web-based application. If you saw my thing yesterday that I did, where there's like this magic cookie that just shows up out of nowhere and gets sent off, that was plumbed into the operating system through this token broker component. All right?
Are those OpenID Connect tokens or are they something else?
I don't know so I believe this is all actually ends up being FIDO-spec stuff, but I really actually don't know about any of the format. It's a token that Azure AD will accept that's opaque to you. You can't really tell what it is, but it is signed by that key material. So the validation, since Azure AD knows what the public key is, it will be able to validate the signature. It all ends up being PKI stuff at the end of the day. All right, everything else, at least at this point, uses client TLS and a device authentication. So I guess the other thing that's interesting with Windows 10 is that the device and the user authenticate simultaneously. So that token that gets sent up, there's just one token, and it contains the identity of the device and the user, and may also convey the MFA state of the user as well too. So there's a bunch of stuff that goes with that, but there's one auth that tells Azure AD both pieces, and that's always done. So on the other platforms, client TLS, what happens is that device authentication is actually done when it's needed. It's not always done. So if you have a policy that requires this, it will actually dump you over into a little client TLS workflow where the certificate gets used and you log in that way, which can also create some weird user experiences. Sometimes you'll see like a little certificate prompt pop up for some of this stuff. The mobile stuff will likely evolve a lot as the authenticator apps and other plumbing in the operating system evolve and Microsoft is able to do more interesting things there. I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of this stuff moves to more like the token broker model, but the thing is Microsoft doesn't control the operating system for either of the two major platforms, so their ability to get in there and add as much value as they have in Windows 10 is a lot more limited. I'm going to skip this, and I kind of want to, I think, sort of move off to the end. But, well, just really quickly, essentially what's happening during a policy check is that we go through the authentication process. If the policy requires manager compliant device, then that authentication will be performed. If the device is then found to be, it successfully authenticates, is found in Azure Active Directory, and is found to have the required state for the policy, then the access will be granted. The other thing that's interesting and useful is in the Azure AD logs, the device's identity will actually be logged when this happens. And one of the cool things with Windows 10 is that because you always do device auth, the device identity is always there even if the policy didn't require it. So kind of a cool little trivia bit. But the Azure AD logs can be pretty useful as a result.
Well, there's some interesting implications because I have accounts in 3 different Azure AD directories, but the machine can only be a member of one of them.
Microsoft has not figured out multiple login in a really useful way. Like Google is actually really good at this, and this is a struggle, and this is actually a huge problem that we have internally.
It's a big consulting problem.
Yeah, it's certain. Well, so here's another thing that's not really clear yet. I don't know if any of you attended Thomas's talk where he was talking about all the B2B stuff. So what if I have an app that requires manager compliant device, but I allow a guest from another tenant to log in? Manager compliant according to whom? It can't be according to me because I will never trust his device because it's not in my Azure AD. It will never get there. Would I even accept your assertion that your device is manager compliant from my perspective? Like it's more of like a conceptual conundrum, but it also I don't think it actually works yet one way or the other.
But it's also an issue for Azure information protection. Mm-hmm. Where different companies may have different information policies, and which one are you actually using? And switching between them is not always.
There are many interesting policy and computer science problems left to be solved in this space. This is definitely getting paved as we speak. Real quickly, I was actually thinking of maybe trying to demo this on my laptop, but I just grabbed a screenshot of what happened. So on this laptop with my test app, I get dumped off to this error, which says I can't get in. I don't know if you guys have ever seen the "you can't get there from here" error. This is actually interestingly customizable. You can. There's a way to actually have it go to your own web page, but. And let's see what I think it's about time to wrap up. I will just allude to the fact that there's also some neato stuff you can do with on-prem because you can actually write back all these device objects, and if you have the right versions of ADFS, it will also auth this stuff. Just make sure that you have ADFS 4 if you're going to do Windows 10 because ADFS 3 doesn't support it. All the token broker stuff is too new for ADFS 3. And a little bit of troubleshooting stuff, and I think that's basically all I wanted to get through. So there's a whole bunch of different things, like all the modern auth troubleshooting I talked about yesterday is very relevant. The data's in the graph. If you're writing back, it's also you can do LDAP queries to go look at it, which is cool. And Azure AD logs, the dsreg command. To check status on a Windows 10 machine. Lots and lots of stuff that you can do and may be doing in order to make this stuff work. But anyway, that's what I wanted to get through today. I hope this was interesting and useful to you guys. And we have a moment or two for questions, I'll be happy to try and answer them. Or we can clear out and talk about it later over beer.
Joe, you got one about is managed and is compliant. You mentioned that's like an all flag.
Well, so
it's
interesting because there are 2 separate checkboxes, and because they're separate checkboxes and you can layer policies as ands and ors, you could you can do some interesting stuff with that. The way it actually used to work was mandatory. It was a checkbox for managed or compliant device, and that UI is actually new enough that I'm not even really used to thinking about the problem that way. Most of the time, people are going to do managed or compliant device. I also. The other notion is a compliant managed device, and how does can you actually get that to work, and then is that the actual goal? I think actually that is the goal. You really want to make sure that your managed devices are compliant, because that means that you've done, it's not just domain joined, you hopefully have some notion that it hasn't been owned in some way, shape, or form. But I also don't think that's a replacement for a PAW. So,
Not a replacement for what?
not a replacement for a privileged access workstation. Unless you really, really trust what SCCM is able to do in terms of telling you how compliant your machine is. Okay, so anyway, that was my talk. Hopefully you guys got something out of it, and thanks a lot.